Pollock. Okay, so lack of power, obviously, is my dilemma. So how do we start moving towards the power? On page 46, it talks about two very simple things. And if I can do these two little simple things, I'm promised that I'm going to get some results. I'm going to begin to get some results in my life. This is not the end game, but this is the beginning. In the middle of page 46, the third line down in the middle paragraph, it talks about the first thing. It says, we found that as soon as we were able to lay aside prejudice. Sounds like a simple enough thing, but I don't think it's that easy. One of the reasons that's difficult is that I don't know that my prejudices are prejudices. My ego is the most defended entity in the universe. It developed an amazing capacity for self-justification, an amazing ability to rationalize, justify, minimize, to shift subtly in perceptions of reality to make it right, to make its judgments seemingly authentic, when in actuality they're fancied to bolster itself. And so I don't know that my prejudices are prejudices because they don't seem like it. I've never had a prejudice that as I'm thinking about it, it occurs to me this is a prejudice. It's not a prejudice, it's right. It's just the way it is. I mean, I don't think it's a prejudice. And so to uncover some of these things and to simplify my mind and reduce my ego enough that I would almost need to be childlike. And most of us come here childish, and we're trying to transition to childlike. To know the most important thing I would ever know is that I don't know. To lay aside these prejudices. One of the things I do with guys that I first start working with is after I interview them with the process that it talks about in working with others, to ascertain if they are alcoholic and if they're willing to go to any lengths, or at least have the trappings of being willing to go to any lengths. We start to talk about prejudices, old ideas. And one of the things I noticed about myself and a lot of the guys I've worked with over the years is that these prejudices are not dominantly cognizant. In other words, they're not right here in your thinking. They're subtle. Sometimes they exist in me on an emotional level that I'm not even aware of cognizantly. And yet they influence me just the same. They're a sense or a feeling about life that motivates me and drives me. Sometimes they're fear. A lot of prejudices are fear-based. Matter of fact, I would venture to say that they all are to some degree. One of the common prejudices that so many of us have is this sense or feeling that on your worst day, on a day that you've just done something you're very, very ashamed of, and you knew better, and you caved and you did something, maybe you exploded on someone, maybe one of your kids because you were frustrated and you were full of fear and you just blew up and you just terrorized them as you screamed at them. Or maybe on a day driven by loneliness and vacancy, maybe you ended up in a compromising situation and having sex with someone you wouldn't want anyone to even know you'd have lunch with. Maybe you cheated on your spouse or your person you're emotionally involved with. Maybe you just did something with money because you were afraid. On those days, the prejudice is is a sense that when I've done my worst and I can't stand myself, that God's not there for me at that time. And the reason that this is a deep-seated, unconscious, and yet deadly prejudice is that there will never be a time in my life where I will need God more than at those times. And the prejudice does not affect God. It only affects me. And it will drive a guy like me to turn in unworthiness away from the light. And it'll push me in the opposite direction from when I need to go towards God. My fear of God and His judgment and my unworthiness will drive me in the opposite direction. And and if you're like me, you don't even know you're doing that. It's just emotionally pushing you that way because you believe it. I was over in Italy. If you ever get a chance to go to the city of Florence, what a remarkable city, steeped in Renaissance art. And there's a statue over there that I'd heard about and wanted to see very badly. And my first trip I went over there, I couldn't find it. I had wrong information. I finally got over there again and I knew the museum. It was called the Opry, and it's a statue by a Renaissance sculptor Donatello, and it's a statue of it's called the Magdalena. It's a statue of Mary Magdalene, and I've heard about it from my friend Jim, and I found it. And as I walked into the room where the statue of the Magdalena was, as I saw it, I caught my breath. It was remarkable. It was a life-size statue of Mary Magdalene in a depiction that was unlike anything you'd probably ever see of Mary Magdalene. This is not a depiction of a woman that's beautiful with long flowing hair and robes. This is a life-size statue of a woman who's obviously suffering from malnutrition, who is dressed in dirty, filthy, tattered rags. A woman with evidence of being beaten severely time and time again. A woman that stands and walks with a countenance of shame. A woman who obviously has been turning nickel and dime tricks on the back alleys of the Middle East for years. And in her self-loathing and shame, she's standing there and her head's cocked slightly to the side. In the midst of her self-loathing and shame, there's an inquisitiveness, and she has her hands in front of her, not in prayer. There's a hesitancy in her hands as if she doesn't deserve to pray. And she's looking up at God as if she were saying, this could be for me. And I stood there and I looked at that statue and I started to weep. I started to weep because I saw into my own soul. I saw into the guy who had dimed his buddies out so he wouldn't go to prison. I saw into the soul of the guy who'd broken the heart of every person who ever tried to love him. I saw into the soul of the guy who stabbed his last best friend with a knife and almost killed him. I looked into the soul of the guy who hated himself. I looked into me, and I started to weep, because that's me. And I came here with this deep-seated, subtle, unrecognized sense of unworthiness when it came to God. And I think out of it came all my fear and prejudice. Out of it came my atheism, my wannabe atheism for years, as I tried to convince myself there wasn't a God, because I knew that if there was, he's not going to love a piece of crap like me. And yet, if we can do the second thing that it talks about, not only lay aside our prejudice, then the second thing it says, and express even a willingness to believe. You don't have to believe. Matter of fact, I think it's better if you're skeptical. I think it's almost, it's odd. Sometimes the people who have the hardest time with God are the ones that think they're there, that have a whole head full of information about God. That's clergy sometimes. If you ever tried to sponsor a member of the clergy, it's like sponsoring an alcoholism counselor. They know everything. They have a hard time becoming childlike because they have a head full of information. But information is not God. Ideas are not God. God is God. And it blocks them. It doesn't really help. And if I could express even a willingness. And the old timers, when I was new, they knew I didn't believe in God. And they don't care. We want you to pray. Well, I don't believe in God. That's okay. We want you to pray. On your knees. On my knees? Why not on my knees? I hear people talking in meetings. They pray on the can. They pray driving to work. Why do I have to get on my knees? They said, well, not everybody does. Just guys with egos like yours. He said, it's not because God wants you to get on your knees. It's just good for you. And I was living in a men's halfway house. Not a good place to pray. I've been institutionalized a lot. I am not getting on my knees in front of a bunch of guys in a room. They'll have a dress on me within a week. I'm not going to do it. I am not going to do it. So I'd go in the bathroom in the morning, lock the door, take the throw rug, push it up under the crack in the door so nobody could peek under there and see me pray, and get down on my knees. Felt like a hypocrite just saying words in the air, but they told me to do it, so I'm doing it. I'd say this real simple prayer. Guy told me, he said, just ask whatever's running the universe. I don't have to use the word God, because he knew that I had prejudice from my childhood about God. Just ask whatever is running the universe for help. My first concept of God came from the movie Star Wars, The Force. I could get my mind, I could say, okay, that could be something like that. Yeah. But I was so afraid of God, so afraid. And I started praying. And from the moment I started turning my consciousness in disbelief towards God, He started to show up in my life. I started to experience an amazing series of coincidences. Now, this is not conscious contact. This is the beginning of faith, which is necessary in order to turn into conscious contact eventually through the rest of the steps. I was just developing the rudimentary, basic stuff. And I started praying, and miracles started, little coincidences happening. That's a miracle where God wants to remain anonymous. Funny little things happen, and I know they've happened to you if you're praying. I mean, we get a little jaundice to them after a while. We get used to them, but the little coincidences, like you go to a meeting and you're all messed up and you don't even know why. And there'll be some stranger in the meeting talking about what's going on with you in a way that you get it and you understand what you need to do. I remember going to work one day, and I got into work, and my boss, now I'm sober long enough to have enough self-esteem to be dangerous, and my boss disrespected me. And you can't, now I got my rights back. You can't do that to me. And I want to, he disrespects me, and then he leaves to go for an appointment. I just cooked on, I wanted to punch him out, except he was a ex-Golden Gloves champion, and I'm angry. I'm not stupid. But I'm going to quit my job, but I can't just quit now because I got to wait for him to come back. So, because you got to have your parting remark. You know how that is. You just can't quit. You got to let them know they're wrong as you're leaving, And I'm cooking on this. Comes almost lunch hour, and this thought comes into me. It was not from the normal place. It came from somewhere else. And the thought was, you need to go to that noon meeting. And I instead of going down to the lunch counter and having lunch like I usually do, played video games. I got my car and raced across town to this noon meeting. Walked in, the meeting had already started. and I sit in my chair and settle in. Just about the time I'm sort of actually mentally showing up in the meeting, a guy starts to share a story that blew my mind. He started talking about how his boss had asked him to do something and he didn't do it. And when his boss confronted him, he gave him a lot of excuses and he wanted to quit his job. And he talked to his sponsor and sponsor said, quit your job. You got to make amends to your boss. Your boss was right. And I'm sitting there, and that's exactly what had happened to me. The night before I went home, my boss asked me to do something, but I was in a hurry to meet my buddies in AA before the meeting for dinner, and I didn't do it. And when I came in the morning, he saw that it wasn't done, and he confronted me about it. And instead of owning it and saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to do it right away, I gave him a bunch of excuses, which really aggravated him, and he fired at me because he didn't want to hear excuses. He wanted it done. And I'm there, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I got to make amends to my boss. And I wanted to quit this. Amends are funny. My ego would rather have me be jobless and homeless and quit the job than look bad and make the amends. I got that. If you're like that, God bless you. You do not have a high mental health quotient. And I tell you, it was only through the grace of God that I was able to go back to work and waited. As soon as I got back, I worked, got everything done exactly the way he wanted it. And when he came back, I was shaken inside. I hate amends. I think they're the nuclear deterrent of the spirit. There's a lot of stuff I don't do today just because I get it. I know what's coming. I'm going to have to make amends, so I go in there. I hate it. And I go up to him, and I was shaking inside, and I said to him, Art, I want you to know I'm really sorry that I didn't do that last night. I was selfishly wanted to do what I wanted to do and get out of here. And then this morning when you asked me about it, I just gave you a bunch of crap rather than just being honest with you and telling you I'm sorry I didn't do it. And it's done, and I won't do that again. I'm sorry. And he put his arm around me, my shoulder, and he said, hey, kid, we all make mistakes. And he went and told me this amazing story about how he did a similar thing when he first got into the business. And the place that had been horrid that I wanted to quit became one of the nicest places to work on earth, just like that. Now, the amazing thing is, who was the choreographer that pushed me intuitively to that meeting, who had the guy start to share the story exactly at the point where I was settled into the meeting enough that I could hear it? Who's behind the curtain pulling the strings here? And I think that for some of us who come here resistant to God, we come to believe as a result of the actions we take that open us to the experience. One of my favorite lines in the book is that God does not make hard terms with those who seek Him. I don't even have to believe in God. If I can just start acting as if He exists, from the moment I begin the actions, even in my doubt and prejudice, I will start to experience coincidences that eventually bring me to believe. Clancy told a story in 1980 that affected me very deeply. I've retold this. I give him credit. The way I tell it's probably not exactly the way he told it. But he said something along the lines that when you hit a bottom with alcoholism, it's very much like being shipwrecked at sea. And you're out in the middle of the ocean and you're treading water hundreds and hundreds of miles from land, and you're in a very desperate situation. And when you're getting really tired and you don't know that you can stay up any longer, all of a sudden, coming across the top of the water is these two guys, and they're just sitting on top of the water and pretending like they're rowing, and they're coming across the water in this invisible boat. And they row up to you and they say, my name's Bill, my name's Bob. We're from Alcoholics Anonymous. We have God and these wonderful 12 steps that will solve all your problems. And you look and you go, you guys got nothing. You're crazy. There's nothing there. Get away from me. And they just row off. Okay. Next. And they go looking for somebody else, I guess, and you're just treading water and you're losing it. And about the time you're about ready to go down, over the horizon comes this big chrome ocean liner. It says treatment center on the side. And they come up to you and they got psychiatrists and psychologists and medications and members of the opposite sex and biofeedback technicians and vocational rehabilitation specialists and little talking sponsor bears and they, oh my God, and people with all these doctorate degrees, and you suspect that a person of your depth and complexity would surely need all of that. And so you get on the ocean liner and you go off to sea, and you're in these groups and you're cracking the secrets of your psyche, and it's fantastic. And you're learning all kinds of amazing things and have this false sense of power now that you know. And about 28 days later, they give you a little chip, graduation chip, and over the side. And there you are, treading water, and you'll watch the boat kind of go off into the distance, and you're there clutching your graduation chip, treading water, and you're all alone. And about the time you're about ready to go down for the last count, here come those two assholes in that invisible boat. My name's Bill. My name's Bob. We're from Alcoholics Anonymous. We got God, and these wonderful 12 steps will solve all your problems. And you think you got nothing, man. You got nothing. But you're dying, and they grab you, and they pull you on board. And there you are, sitting on top of the water. You don't even know how you're sitting there. There's no boat. There's no nothing. As some of us sit in Alcoholics Anonymous meetings at 8, 10, 12 months sober, and we don't know how we've stayed sober this long. We never did before. And you say to them, what do I do? And they say, row. Row what? What? Pretend. Just go like this. And you, all right, start pretending like you're rowing. And a funny thing happens. The more you pretend to row that boat, it just starts to materialize right before your eyes. And the more you row the boat, the more substantial it becomes. And some of us, after 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years of sobriety, we get so comfortable in that boat, we stop rowing. Let the newer people row. And the minute you stop rowing it, it starts to disappear. Alcoholics Anonymous is the only place I've ever come to that has showed me a way to actually access a God and the power of this God that I don't believe in, simply through taking actions I don't even have to believe. I just have to act as if. It's like entering into a working hypothesis. They're presenting a guy like me who's afraid to believe in God with a proposition that in the very fabric of the universe, and even inside of you, Bob, is a power source that will change your life. And you don't believe it, do you, Bob? No, I don't believe it. That's fine. Let's start acting as if it exists and see what happens. Let's start rowing the boat and see if something doesn't materialize. And it always does. I was over in London. I actually go over there almost every year. And I sponsor a bunch of guys over there. And I just love the humor over there and the whole stiff upper lip thing and just the whole deal. And first time over there, I was walking around as a tourist around Hyde Park and down around Buckingham Palace and all through the Westminster district of London, the old historical district. And I noticed something, that all the street lights there were gas, unlike most of our city street lights that are electric. And on the sides of some of the poles, the older poles, were these little boxes. And they had been welded shut and painted over. And I found out later what they were is that many, many years ago, before they had the technology of the electric starters that would light the gas lamps and the computerized system that turned the gas on at a certain time and lit everything, there used to be a guy who would walk up and down the streets of London And he would come to a pole, and that was a door that he could open, and he would stick a key in there, and he'd turn the key, and it would turn the gas on. And he'd reach up with a long pole with a flame on the end, and he'd light the street light. And when this guy with Twilight was doing that, you could climb up to the top of the highest building in London and look out over the city. No matter how hard you looked, you couldn't see where the guy was that was lighting the lamps, but you could see where he'd been. And I could sit in a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous at 1.5 years, 2 years sober as a result of acting as if there was a God, and I could see where God had been in my life. I could see the coincidences. And thank God I was thrown into a group that just hammered me about sponsoring people and 12-step work and hospitals and institutions. And I got a ringside seat in the trenches of recovery to watch the hand of God up close and personal as it reached out and touched the lives of the people that I tried to help. I don't think you'll ever see God closer than in those places, in the trenches, in the places where you'll see things happen that are just spectacular. You'll see homeless guys buy their first house. I've met men and women. I sponsored probably 20 guys that were involved in the mental health industry to the point where they were so medicated they were more dead than alive. They were the zombies that laugh and sponsor guys and free and have taken no medication for years now. And they're free. That you can't get from there to there. You can't. It's beyond human aid. These are men and women who've spent a fortune in hospitals and psychiatric clinics and psychiatrists. No human power. And yet they availed themselves of the power here that changed their life. How can you sit in Alcoholics Anonymous and watch that for a couple decades and doubt? You can't. Even the greatest skeptics of us have to come to believe in time. And it's the beginning. But in and of itself is not enough. On page 55, it talks about a vision of what we're going to find as we start to access this power and we start to make the transition from faith into conscious contact. The 2 paragraphs in the middle of 55 are pretty much a vision of what happens to us as a result of steps 4 through 9. In this process of uncovering, discovering, and discarding. It says in the middle paragraph, the second paragraph, it says, actually, we were fooling ourselves. For deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. Deep down inside of me? It seemed like a crazy idea to me. How could something so good and so powerful, evidently, be inside something that was so weak and so corrupt? It didn't make any sense to me. And yet I heard people over and over again talk about the God within, talking about listening to the still small voice of God. I remember standing in the line to thank Chuck Chamberlain at our intergroup meeting, a monthly intergroup meeting, and there's a guy in front of me in line that's asking Chuck, where do you find God? And Chuck has that little laugh, and he says he's not lost. He's right in there and pointing in the guy's chest. What does that mean? There was a woman that I used to go to meetings with named Diantha. And Diantha was a pretty spiritual gal. And she was a knitter. You know, one of those people that just sit and knit, just sort of smile and knit. And me and some other idiot newcomer, we learned that if we used the F word, she'd knit a little quicker. So I think we were trying to get sparks to fly off our knitting needles or... And one time, but I always listened to her because she was very soothing. Everything she said was very spiritual. And one time she's talking about how much she enjoyed sitting alone with her God and just communing by herself with God with no interference, no TV, no radio, just her communing alone with God. And the way she said it sounded kind of cool, being a kid of the 70s and meditation and TM and everything. It's like, yeah, go home and commune with God. Let's get quiet. Went home, didn't turn the stereo on, no TV, just me alone with God. And I discovered that when it gets quiet out here, it gets very noisy in here. In about 30 seconds, I had a panic attack. I had to turn the TV on. I felt like I go inside me to find God. I don't find God. I find Legion. I find like a pack of crazy people. So what is it? Are they just screwing with me? Or is God really inside me? And is there something wrong with me? That I can't access God inside of me like you people talk about? Yes, there is. The next line says that the problem is, Bob, you're blocked. God's obscured from you by aspects of you. You got too much of you between you and God. You got the first thing that blocks me and obscures me from God is calamity. It's the clamor. Bill talks about the worldly clamors that immediately blot out God, the newfound connection he made in Towns Hospital. There's some people here that know. I met this gal named Vera. She told me a story a couple years ago upstate New York that really affected me. She said that if you were to go back and read Genesis in the original language that it was written in, and you got to the part about the Garden of Eden, and in the original language, the word that they used for serpent would not be translated literally into the English as the word for serpent. She said actually the word they used would have been translated as the sound of the serpent makes. It's not the word for serpent, it's the word, the sound the serpent makes. And it just hisses. You can hear the hiss and the slither. You can hear it in the tall grass of your life, but you can't see it. But it's just kind of there, and it just talks to you. It's just always chattering to you. It's just saying things like, your sponsor doesn't want you to date yet because they're old and they don't know. It says things like, they want you to always help others. They just don't want to do it. That's why. It just says things to you. Why do you have to listen? You're going to become dependent on these people. Don't listen to them. It says things like, your boss has been using you and mistreating you. You should quit. That would show him. It says, what's this guy doing with his hand next to his head? It just talks to you, It just talks to you. It never goes away. It's always there. Now, on a good spiritual hair day, it's like music in the doctor's office. It chatters, it clamors, but I don't even know. I don't pay any attention. It's just always, I'm here. That's there somewhere. I'm here. On a bad spiritual hair day, which really means that I'm in the bondage of self, that's when it's right here. It just gets on me like that creature in that movie Alien that attaches itself to your face. And it's all I will hear and see. And that's when I really become disconnected from life itself, because God isn't in my head. God is in reality. It talks about that in chapter 5. It tells you exactly where you're going to find God. There is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him in a place that most of us seldom visit. Now. I'm not a now guy. I'm a guy who ponders now. I'm a guy who likes to read about now. I'm a guy who likes to philosophize about now. We can discuss now. I will tell you my thoughts about now, but I'm not really now. I'm a guy who circles now in my head, but I'm not really now much. And that's where God is, and that's where you are, right here, right now. And I think one of the things that Alcoholics Anonymous is trying to do is to other-center me or externalize me. I love that line in the 12 by 12. It says, Bacchus allowed us to live extemporaneously. That means out of myself. That I can be here where you are and God is and reality is, rather than up here in the la land of Bob. And I think a lot of us, we don't even live in our own lives. We live in the story of our lives up here. That's why in Alcoholics Anonymous we have a book, As Bill Sees It. Al-Anon's more legitimate. They have Lois Remembers. I think, and you want to get it. If you've ever had the experience of sitting down and having a conversation with one of your siblings about your childhood, I did that with my sister, and I kept my mouth shut, thank God, but she's saying things, and I keep thinking, it wasn't like that. It was, and I wanted to correct her, and in the middle of my urgency to correct her, the thought came to me, this must have been from God, the thought came to me, Bob, with your track record, if one of your two perceptions is not right, which one do you think it would be? Hers! No, it would be me. I kept my mouth shut. I'll tell you, to this day, she said some things. I still think it wasn't like that. And maybe it was. Polly was talking about this. I just caught myself. I've had this one story that I told for 35 years, and I believed it. And it was not just recently. I'm in the middle of telling it again. And as I'm telling it, it was like the veil lifted. And it was like, that didn't even happen. I never was part of that motorcycle gang. I told that story for 35 years. And I believed it. So if you ever hear me tell my story, it's the rumor of my story. I'm not sure it's my story. Polly.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. Thanks. I love, one of the things I'm hoping you're enjoying, Bob is such a storyteller. I love it. It's just, I love to hear his stories. One of the things that I began to, and this came to believe in a power greater than ourselves that could restore us to sanity, is that I believe this is where sponsorship really starts to formulate for me, because and, you know, sponsors, it's like, I know for a fact that Frank was not God. And I know for a fact that I'm not God when I work with women. But what happened is he became almost what I want to say is, I forget to do this, as kind of God with skin on them. Because what happened is that I began to have a trust and in God. And I'm going to tell a little story that I don't know if any of you remember a man by the name of Keith Lewis. And Keith was an amazing man. And Keith used to talk about the difference between faith and trust. A lot what Bob's been talking about too, the faith and the trust. And Keith was about a tightrope walker that had a wheelbarrow. And that, you know, you can sit in the audience and you can see him get ready to cross the tightrope with the wheelbarrow and have faith that he's going to make it. He's going to get across there and he's going to make it. Trust will come when I get in the wheelbarrow and then walk across. And what happened for me is I think that's what happened when I began to have trust. Trust that Frank loved me. He wanted to give me the right information. And I know when I can remember when I finished my 5th step with Frank. And And I knew that, it's like he was the first person that told me, Polly, you can tell anybody the truth if you tell it with love. He says, because we can take the truth and we can beat people to death with it and they can't hear us. But you can tell anybody the truth if you tell it with love. And when I had finished my 5th step with him, and this is getting ahead, and we'll talk about this stuff later, but I had gone through treatment, so I'd done a Hazelton 5th step. I was born and all of that stuff. And we did it exactly as it was in the big book. And I can remember him looking at me. And the time that was the most painful is when he looked at me and he said, Polly, you're a child abuser. And, I just couldn't swallow those words. I hurt my kids, and, I could soft pedal it. But when he would tell me things, I began to trust them. And that was the hardest thing. But through the time up until I'd done that, I began to trust the stuff that he was telling me. And he would tell me, and over, and I say this so much, is he would just say, Polly, just believe that I believe. But when he started to give me instructions of what to do, the actions to take, the stuff Bob was talking about, go help somebody, go be the setup person at your group. Back then we all smoked and we washed coffee cups. Go wash the ashtrays, do the coffee cups, clean, be the setup person, the cleanup. And I would look at him and I'd just say, well, what does that have to do with being sober? I couldn't understand what all this stuff had to do with being sober. And he'd just say, well, just trust that this is going to help you stay sober. But taking these actions and doing these things in Alcoholics Anonymous helped me come to believe in that power, that the power of Alcoholics Anonymous would keep me sober. And that power was directed to me from Frank. I was very newly sober, and I look at our AA history. And if you love history, it's marvelous to read the things and to hear our archivists talk about the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and all of these miracles. And if one little brick would have been out of place, we wouldn't be here today. And how God magically orchestrates all of that. And it can only be done by God. And I think about when I was brand new sober, I had just gotten out of the treatment center, and I was over at Frank's house, and he introduced me to his sponsor, who was a man by the name of Frank Honeycutt. And this man lived in Long Beach, California, and Frank and I lived in Hurst, Texas. And what would happen is that Frank was my sponsor, and then along came, I went to a meeting, and I had met Frank Honeycutt. I'm not going to know much about Frank Honeycutt. I'm going to meet him again in 1980 when I'm 3 years sober, when I go to New Orleans to the first AA conference, because, of course, we're going to all be with the Long Beach people in 1980. And what's going to happen is, in the meantime, I heard a woman speak in Austin, Texas, and her name was Dottie H. And I heard her speak at a conference, and she lived in Lakewood, California. And I just said to myself, I have no aspirations of ever going to Lakewood, California. That's not even, on my radar chart. I'm married to another man, and all of this stuff is going on. And I just kind of said, gosh, if I'm ever anywhere she is, I want, I would have her for my sponsor, because Frank was always telling me to get a woman. And I tried it. I got a woman sponsor. And at 1 year of sobriety, we went to Acapulco because we were going to celebrate my 1 year, and she was going to go with me, and she got drunk. And I said, and Acapulco. And I come charging back to Texas, and I tell Frank, you see what happens when I get a woman sponsor? And so I didn't want a woman sponsor, but I said, if I ever was in California, well, this is going to be, 3.5 years later. I end up divorcing my husband, marrying Dave. We moved to Michigan. And then in 1981, Dave had lived most of his life in Southern California. And he says, let's go to Southern California. And I remember that woman. And I said, we can go to Southern California because Frank Honeycutt's there. He lives in Long Beach, and this will be perfect. And one of the things I find out is Dottie and Frank Honeycutt are like best friends. You can't make this stuff up. You can't make it up. Dottie's been my sponsor since 1981. You can't make this stuff up. Frank Honeycutt became my husband's sponsor, became my son's sponsor, became the finest, most wonderful man I have ever known. I can remember being at a conference, and this woman who also knew Frank that went to the Pacific group, and we were just talking about Frank, and Frank had just died. And she says, I have never heard anybody say a bad word about Frank Honeycutt. I mean, can you imagine having a life like that? That nobody even said a bad word about? And I met this guy in Hearst, Texas, and then would come to, know him. I remember when he died, I just climbed up in his hospital bed and I just held on to him because I loved him so much. You can't make this stuff up. And this is God. This is God. And it's just those God shots that you go back. And Frank used to do that all the time. He would take me back to these miracles and show me these miracles that were happening in Alcoholics Anonymous and make me aware of them. And today, I get to stop and see those miracles. But what that happened is it came first from that sponsorship. I had to trust Frank, and in trusting Frank led me to trust God. And that didn't mean that I made Frank God, because he wouldn't have ever let me do that, because he always knew where the juice was. He knew the juice was God, and that everything we do is through us. And I'm just grateful that I was given that. And I think so many of us, I know that's how I hear Bob talk about his sponsors, that they gave us. He gave me how to go to an AA meeting, how to dress at an AA meeting, because I wanted a lot of attention. I was so empty inside, I just knew that if you'd love me enough, I'd be okay. And he tried to explain to me, that these men are not going to make you feel okay. But he didn't hurt me and put me down. He says, I just pray that you get through this stage of your life sober. That you get through this sober. And by God's grace, I got through it sober. I paid a lot of consequences, but I got through it sober. So today, when women come to me and they've done all these things they're so ashamed of, I just say, you know what? Let me just sit down. We're going to talk about this. You did it drunk. And somehow in my head, I think if you do it sober, it's worse. It doesn't matter. It's all the same. It's all the degradation we bring on ourselves. I just my degradation was passed out on the sofa, not taking care of children and abusing them and not paying attention to them. And I had to get into AA and do all the stuff that everybody does drunk sober. So, and it's just coming to believe God loves me anyway. My husband loved me. He's so forgiving. Dave said to me, Polly, I don't want to have an affair with you. I want to marry you. I mean, where does that come from? How do people get that? But this is just all this coming to believe. And one of the things I just kind of want to move in, I don't know if Bob's through with step 2, but I just kind of want to move into step 3 from here. Because when it comes to step 3, it was like made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And I just didn't understand how to do that. How do I turn my will and my life over to God as I understand Him? Last night we were at Friendly's having the meeting after the meeting, and I was listening to Patrick say, this is where I learned to turn it over. You know, and people would say, just turn it over. Turn it over. And I mean, that just made no sense to me. It's just, what do you mean, turn it over? I just couldn't get that. And Frank kept what happened for me on step 3, because I got sober in Texas. And even though I had come out of a treatment center that was a 5-step treatment center, Frank wasn't buying those 5 steps, okay, that I took in that treatment center. Because he believed that the 4th step that I took was like an autobiography. It was that Hazelton, you know, I was born, and he wanted me to take, he wanted to do the steps with me. Well, in where I got sober in Texas, we did the steps quickly, because the deal was get through the steps so that you can start working with other people. That's how you stay sober. Get through the steps. And it was, don't worry about doing it perfectly, because you got a lifetime to keep doing it. Just get through the steps. So what he wanted to do was make sure that I was powerless over alcohol, and that my life was unmanageable, and wanted to know that, came to believe in a power greater than myself. You know, what's got you? What kept you from dying in that ambulance? What was there? What happened? What's the power of the group? Get in there and find the power. And now he's talking about turning it over. And I don't know how to turn this over to God. I mean, I can get glimpses of this power, but I don't understand it. And what he did was he pointed it out to me, and he says, it's made a decision to turn our will and our lives over the care of God as we understand it. And he said, Polly, what you're going to do is you're going to make a decision. And that decision is like if you decide to go to college. What you do is you make a decision to go to college, and then you spend the next 4 years doing it. And what he said is, what we're going to do, what this step is that we're going to make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. And then we're going to spend the next steps making that decision, steps 4 through 9. That's what we're going to do. But you can't go on to step 4 if you haven't made that decision. The first requirement, and this is, I'm going to be on page 60, and I'm going to be the last paragraph at the bottom of page 60. The first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. And I believe that's where Frank came into play, because Frank was very willing to tell me what to do. And I am grateful for that. Tell me how to go to meetings, how to dress at meetings, what to do at meetings, was telling me what to do. Give people rides. Polly, you're blessed. You're in Alcoholics Anonymous. You have a car. Give people a ride. That's one of the things I tell people that I sponsor. You know, you don't think you can be of service? Give these 2 women that I sponsor don't have a ride. Give them a ride. Get them to meetings. Take them places. Take them to the doctor. Do things, because one of them can't get a driver's license for another 1.5 years. Even if she could afford a car, she can't get one. So do something with these people. On that basis, we are almost in collision with something or somebody. Even though our motives are good, most people try to live by self-propulsion. And that's what I had done. I had been trying to live by my will. Now, the thing I need to be able to is see that my way doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be convinced to turn my will and my life over to the care of Frank, and he's going to show me how to begin to do this. And this is what I'm going to do, because that's going to bring me to God. Now, that does not say that any sponsor is God. That is just saying that I'm going to turn my will and listen to Him. And I love when I hear that just kind of, what we're going to do is we're just going to make the ground fertile and dig it up and get it prepared and put in all of the nutrients and the fertilizer so that God can get in there and work. And that I can begin to see that God's working in my life. And that I'm going to be able to do things and make a decision that God is going to work in my life. I can see that God's working in Frank's life. I can see that God's working in your life because you're sober. You've got sponsees. I can tell that there's a difference in you. So what happens is I've got to be willing to do that. I've got to ask God to do that. So what I'm doing is I'm making a decision that I'm going to allow the rest of the steps to work in my life. And that's what happened for me, is to see that I came to believe that a power greater than myself could restore me to sanity. And now I'm going to turn my life over to that power. And what I believe is, because Frank kept telling me, is you believe that I believe in this power. And I believed in that power that worked in Frank's life. And Frank kept telling me, I didn't find God in the church. I found God in Alcoholics Anonymous. Even though I preached God, I didn't know God like I know God today. What I have to begin to be is I have to be. I was always looking for things for self. I'm having all these affairs with these men because I want them to make me feel good. So the book says, is he not really a self-seeker even when he's trying to be kind? I was always trying to get my own way. And this is on page 61, down at the second paragraph at the bottom of that second paragraph. Is he not a victim of the delusion that if he can wrest satisfaction and happiness out of this world if he only manages well? And what Frank is trying to tell me, none of these things are making you happy. With your self-seeking and the things you want to do for self, none of this is making you happy. Why don't you be willing to turn it over to this power that's keeping you sober? Is it not evident to all the rest of the players, because we're talking about here, now if I can only manage the stage right, if I can only manage the players right, I can only do all these things to make you love and like me, I'm going to be fine. None of that's working. Why don't you give it to this power? Is it not evident to all the rest of the players that these are the things he wants? And do not his actions make each of them wish to retaliate? So every time I try to get you to do what I want, you don't want to do it. It's not working. Self-reliance is failing me. Our actor is self-centered, egocentric, as people like to call it today. And then we go on to the first paragraph, really on page 62. And I love this. I think this is the best. I love this about step 3. Selfishness and self-centeredness That, we think, is the root of our troubles. Driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity, we step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us seemingly without provocation, but we invariably find that at some time in the past we have made decisions based on self which later placed us in a position to be hurt. I placed myself in a position to be hurt by trying to get men in the program to love me and give me things. And I placed myself in a position to be hurt. And by God's grace, I did not drink. And I believe right there that a power greater than myself was saving me from myself. And I got to have those things pointed out to me. You know, didn't God do that for you, Polly? And you don't want to turn your will and your life over to this God? Didn't He do that for you? So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. And I love what the 12 and 12 says in step 10, that whenever I'm disturbed, no matter what the cause, there's something wrong with me. My troubles are of my own making. I create this. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme. There we go back to that word again that Bob was talking about. An extreme example. Not just an example, an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. I love what my husband Dave said. He said his sponsor, because he got sober in Texas, and we all learned to do the steps quickly. And his sponsor said to Dave, Dave, you ought to be willing to turn your will and your life over to anybody who's willing to take it. Because obviously what you're doing's not working. And that's what I began to do. Be willing to turn my will and my life over to anybody who was willing to take it. And because of actions that Bob is talking about, that Frank had me do, actions for this God that was keeping me sober. And I love there's some people in AA that I love this, and I heard this the other day, that are saying, in Texas, we give our sobriety date. And I had friends that were visiting from Texas, and even when you share at a meeting, you don't even have to be the speaker, just share. You give your sobriety date every time you share. And I had these friends visiting with me a couple of weeks ago, and we were in a discussion meeting, and sure enough, they shared and gave their sobriety date. And that's just what we do, is give our sobriety date. Well, I heard the other day someone say, gave their sobriety date, and the way they did it was, God separated me from alcohol on this date. Because basically that's what happened. That God separated me from alcohol. I was, one day I can't drink, I drink no matter what. And the next day I'm sober. That has been removed. That has been removed from me. And doing these steps keep that miracle in place and keep me sober a day at a time. So what happened is I was an example of self-will run riot, though I didn't think so. I didn't think that I was self-will run riot. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. And what he was trying to explain to me is if I do these things in Alcoholics Anonymous, these things attacked that selfishness. If I go give people rides that I don't want to give. Somebody came up to me and said, what did it mean when I was talking about what Clancy says about taking actions contrary to the way I feel? how inconvenient it is to go give somebody a ride. I go do it anyway. How silly it seems to wash all these ashtrays. I do it anyway. How silly it sounds to say, you're a newcomer, you stand at the door and greet. Why? As Frank would say, because I said so. I used to hear that a lot, because I said so. You don't know it yet, but it'll make you feel better. Just take these actions. And what happens is, by taking these actions, I begin to see a power greater than myself working in my life. I began to see the miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I become willing to make a decision to turn my will and my life over to God as I understand Him. I'm going to turn it back over to Bob, but there's a couple of things that I want to read at the bottom of page 62 because I love, love, love this part of the book. I love it. And I love the words in the paragraph that it starts out with. This is the how and the why of it. First of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. I realized that trying to play God in my children's life, even though I was the parent, what I tried to do was I tried to get my children to act and behave through force. And that doesn't work. All that made is my children angrier and more rebellious. That's the only thing that I created in my sons was anger and rebellion by trying to force my will on them. I had no skills in which to teach. One of the things that my husband uses that I love, he said, I stopped being a director and started being a coach. Start trying to coach and teach. And what I was doing was trying to force my will on my children. It doesn't work. I tried to force my will on my husband, and all it did for me is make them really angry and cause me to go into these absolutely crazy rage attacks talk about extreme behavior. Uncontrollable rage. Next, we decided that hereafter in this drama of life, God was going to be our director. God was going to show me what to do. He is the principal. We are His agents. And what is an agent? Someone who publicizes God, talks about God. I'm His agent. I'm going to talk about God. I'm going to tell people about God. God is doing this. He is the Father, and we are His children. Most good ideas are simple, and this concept was the keystone of the new and triumphant arc through which we pass to freedom. When we sincerely took such a position, all sorts of remarkable things followed. We had a new employer. Being all-powerful, He provided what we needed. And I'm here to tell you, I run back to that example all the time. First of all, I worked for a very long time. Today, I get to enjoy the benefits of Social Security and a little retirement check from a company I worked for a long time. I get to enjoy those benefits. But I sponsor a lot of women, and I always want to say, we have a new employer. And that's what I have. I have a new employer. God is the employer. He provides the source of which we get. We may get a paycheck I get my paycheck from the government, but that employer is God. That is from God through the government. They just write the check. He provided what we needed. And here comes the big warning. If we kept close to Him and performed His work well. And I have to remember that. Just today is that sentence today for me is as important to me as it was 35 years ago when I first read this book and began to take step 3. Is that I have to stay close to Him and perform His work well. That's my job. That's my job. I may have had a job before I retired. I may have had an employer that I got a paycheck from. But the reality is what my job is. Just as our preamble says, my primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. My job is to stay close to Him and perform His works well. Establish the promise, established on such a footing, we become less and less interested in ourselves. The more I think about you, the less I think about me, and my depression is lifted. That's the antidote for depression, working with others. If somebody walks up to me and tells me they're depressed, they tell me they don't feel like they fit in AA, I suffer from depression, my first question is, how many people do you sponsor? How many people are you working with? First question. Most of the time, it's none. I said, if I didn't have all these women to talk to, I don't have a clue what I do for them. But if I didn't have all these women to talk to, and I had to listen to my head, I'd have had a gun in my mouth a long time ago. Couldn't stand it. Our little plans and designs, interested in ourselves, our little plans and designs. More and more we become interested in seeing what we could contribute to life. I am not a person who wants to see what I can contribute to life. I am out there trying to get mine. Today, I absolutely want to see what I can contribute because you know what? I have learned the secret here. The more I give, the better I feel. As we felt new power flow in, as we enjoyed a peace of mind, as we discovered we could face life successfully, as we became conscious of His presence, we began to lose our fear of today, tomorrow, and the hereafter. We were reborn. We began to be reborn. We are reborn by making the decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God as we understand Him. If that isn't a promise, if that isn't absolutely so amazing, that I don't have to do this by myself anymore. There isn't anything that I do in life that I have to do by myself today. I have so many people in my life. It is amazing. I don't have to do anything alone again. I have a promise way back in the Vision for You that talks about I have a host of friends. A host. And I had it way back there in the beginning, and I didn't even know it. I didn't even know it. Being willing to turn my will and my life over to the care of God as I understood Him. And I didn't understand much then. Through the years, God has become absolutely lives in my heart. And on most days, not every day, I can hook to the juice. But way back then, I had to be taught how to hook to the juice. And what happens is all those basic things that I was told to do when I came to Alcoholics Anonymous, I still do those basic things. Nothing much has changed. You heard Bob talk about he goes to detox twice a week, been doing it for over 27 years. I get that. I do the same things I did in the beginning. I still do them today. Those basic things work. The good news is we talk about repetition strengthens and confirms, and faith then comes naturally. We do it over and over and over and over, and the more we do it, the more we believe. I'm going to just talk about one story, and I'm going to let Bob finish up before we go to lunch. In 1993, it was an economy in Southern California much like it is today. And what happened to my husband and I is Dave lost his job. And back then, I think they gave you unemployment for 6 weeks. So what happened is we could not, I have people, I am sorry to say today, who are unemployed will not get a job because they make more money on unemployment than they would if they got a job. Well, and back in 93, and I'm really grateful for that today, we didn't have that. It was about 6 weeks. So what happened is my husband went and got jobs that were minimum wage. He had 2 minimum wage jobs. And that's what we had to do. But what happened is that we ended up losing our home. I mean, our whole neighborhood went up for sale. The housing market was a lot like it is today. And we ended up losing our home and having to file bankruptcy and a lot of horrible things that I never in a million years ever would think would happen to me. But it happened. And I will promise you that there is life after all of that. What happened again was here came 2010. Or 2009. And what happened was my son was invested with us in the property we had built in Birch Bay. We had a beautiful home in Birch Bay. And, it's kind of like Bill said in his story, as I felt like I have arrived. And what happened is my son is self-employed. And what happened is his business went south. He could no longer be invested. We could no longer have the house. So we had to sell the house. Now here we are again in a housing market that is the same. Nothing's selling. We're paying taxes on a house that we're going to have to sell for $100,000 less than what we're paying taxes on. And I'm thinking, here we go. Same song, second verse. Here this is happening again. But the miracle of it is the difference is that Dave and I have made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. And the difference is that we weren't afraid. We knew because experience, Bob and I are sharing our experience, strength, and hope. That's all we have is our experience, strength, and hope. And my experience, strength, and hope had taught me that no matter what, God's got my back. And what happened was we ended up selling that house. We didn't make any money, but we didn't lose any money. And as we walked away from that title company, having had that faith, Dave said, well, it's certainly better than last time. We didn't have to leave the key in the door. What happened and I believe what Bob says, is that when we have faith, that faith is brought to us. When we have fear, the fear is brought to us. And what happens is that I have fear. I don't know that I'll ever get rid of fear. But we have a way to have faith. And what I believe is I can have fear and faith at the same time. I have the fear, but the faith brings me through the fear by God working with me. Turning my will and my life over to the care of God as I understand Him. Bob.
I'm Bob, an alcoholic. Just a couple minutes and then we'll break for lunch. And what's our schedule for lunch?
2:00.
Okay. Alcoholics Anonymous has an unusual approach to God. Some of us have got a glimpse that God was the answer and have gone to spiritual books, gone to churches. We've read about the magnificence of God. We've been sold the proposition of why God would be a better manager.